Hi, I'm Meshal Malik, and you're watching Indus Special. The world around has been amazed by animals coming out on streets as humans go into hiding because of the coronavirus outbreak. African penguins walking through streets in Cape Town, a herd of goats being seen crossing the road in Wales, and a record number of turtle hatchings on Thai beaches. We're also seeing clear skies around the world, which for many parts of the world became a distant memory. But as all of this happens, climate activists remind the world that the climate crisis goes on unabated. The welcomed biodiversity and drop in emissions are temporary changes because of a pandemic, which otherwise would not have been seen, because everything would have been going as business as usual. On today's show, we take a look at how this pandemic, which has crossed 3 million infections and killed over 200,000 people, is putting the climate crisis and environmental degradation in perspective. Joining us for this conversation today is Mr. Svein Hermling, Global Policy Lead on Climate Change and Resilience at CARE International. He joins us from Bonn. Also joining us today is Professor Peter Newman, environmental scientist, author and educator based in Perth. He has written over 20 books, which include Decarbonizing Cities, Sustainability and Cities, and The End of Automobiles. He joins us from Perth. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Mr. Svein Hermling, I'd like to begin with you. Now, part of trying to understand how humans impact the environment around them is trying to also see how we impact biodiversity. Seeing all these animals that we haven't been seeing in our cities, in our urban centers come out, what does that signify? What does that really mean?
Well, I mean, what it signifies in a way is that as mankind, so to say, is a bit on a retreat at the moment because we have less economic activities, we're driving less cars. Many of us have to stay at home to do our best to basically contain the very sad and grief pandemic. But in a way, it looks as if this opens up spaces for animals to come back into cities, etc. So I think in a way it reminds us of the fact that the activities we undertake usual or the immense, let's say, intensity of the traffic, etc., also brings about certain problems, of course. I think the solution, of course, to this is not have the pandemic continue. We need to do our best to contain it. But then when we come to setting up our systems or resetting our systems economies in the next few months, I think we need to consider what benefits have we maybe missed because of many of the economic activities, and how can we learn from the situation?
Right, and learning from the situation, and as you mentioned, how we do that when we try to go towards resetting our cities, resetting our economies, we need to take into mind what has been happening during this lockdown. Professor Peter Newman, now you work with cities, you work on cities and sustainability. So when we talk about biodiversity and it being seen in cities, we always think about that these two things don't they don't mix. Is it possible that in the future we create cities in a way in which we keep in mind biodiversity in their natural habitats? Is that a possibility with the development and the way we develop cities?
Yes, it always has been actually part of cities. We tended to try and scrub them out from the 1950s on. It was kind of like didn't fit into our modern cities, but they do and they should. So biophilic urbanism was a concept developed in the last decade, which is about how we bring plant life and associated insect, bird life, animal life into the city. And we do it on our buildings, like green roofs, green walls, green balconies. Right. And cities like Singapore have tried to show how to do this and have discovered that it cools the city. It's a much better place to live in, and you do have a lot more biodiversity. So it is possible to do, but it is one of these things that needs to be put on the agenda now, and to say we have a new start now after this economic collapse, and this can be one of the things we do for the future.
Professor Peter Newman, when we're putting this up on the agenda, we know when economies are opening up, their main priority will not be how to improve things than how they were before. It's going to be trying to restart as urgently as one can. how can activists, how can people like you who work actively on the environment bring these conversations in so they remain in the mind of those who are actually making decisions on ground?
Yes, it's certainly a question of how can we bounce back. We keep trying to say we should bounce forward. Don't just get back to business as usual, because there's a whole lot of problems there. And the history of collapses economically show that new things emerge which were on the agenda but were hard to do, and they come forward in a way that enables you to recreate the economy. So we should be having projects that demonstrate this new world and try to fund them, to encourage them. I think industry are up for that because they've had lots of ideas about how to create zero carbon, zero poverty communities, how to bring biophilic urbanism in, how to get rid of plastics, all of these things on the agenda, but hard. So get them in as demonstrations and they'll take off. Investors will want to say that's a better future.
Right. Mr. Svein Hermling, as taught Professor Newman and the idea behind integrating biodiversity within the cities, how it should have been, not how we actually went about it. But let's talk about the greater scale of human impact on this biodiversity. A report by WWF in 2018 signified that humanity has caused 60% of loss in mammals, birds, fish. The UN stated that 1 million species are on the brink of extinction. What exactly have our actions been which has been causing wildlife, which has been remote from us, to come on the brink of extinction?
Yeah, I mean, there's of course a variety of activities. I mean, we are now more than 7 billion people on this planet, and although the use of resources, of course, is very different across the world. In each country, we have parts of the population who have a very high per capita resource use, for example, of course, and consumption and resource use often leads into tapping into, let's say, natural areas where animals and ecosystems were in the past still functioning. And I think with that, and on top of that, climate change, which primarily is caused by the burning of fossil fuels, heating up the planet, all these are stress factors which really threaten the well-being of many ecosystems. But I think there's also a lot of lessons from how mankind or how people locally can live with the environment, because it's where many people depend on. I mean, for example, we work in many developing countries, Southern Africa, for example, with people who really depend on local agriculture, local use of ecosystems. And there are also many solutions around how you can do this in the right way. I think what we need to learn or take from this crisis at the moment is that some of the let's say, harming activities, in particular also, for example, air pollution coming from fossil fuels, which kills thousands, hundreds of thousands of people every year, that there are these benefits if some of these activities are reduced and if we find ways to build back better, more inclusive, greener. That is the big moment, I think, which we need to take into account now, where we need to find the right responses so that we get into a better society everywhere, basically.
Right. Mr. Svein Hermling, trying to bring everything into the context of the pandemic we're seeing right now, and linking that to how destruction in ecosystems can lead to greater viruses like the one that we're seeing right now. A lot of climate scientists are trying to urge people to understand this better. How can we break down this information? How can we understand it for those who don't know that much about ecosystem destruction and how that can lead to viruses and coronaviruses especially?
Some of the, let's say, emergence and also adaptation of some of the viruses we haven't been used to are also linked to mankind tapping more and more into ecosystems or into ecosystems which previously may have been less disturbed, and that these interactions also may bring up threats we haven't been used in the past. And I think there's still investigation underway how this specifically is linked to the specific current crisis we're in, but I think it gives us some lessons for the future as well, that there's a lot of benefits of protecting those ecosystems, protecting safe environments, I think we need to draw the right lessons from that.
Right. Peter Newman, now talking more about developing cities and moving towards a sustainable development path, which takes into account natural ecosystems. What are some of the things you feel like need to be kept in mind, especially for cities that are rapidly developing in the developing parts of the world?
Well, I think the key thing is that you need planning to try to show where to develop and where not to develop. The key thing is water. If you build very close to rivers, to wetlands, you will have issues and the water systems will deteriorate quickly. So it's important to build around those parts of a city that are less fragile and vulnerable to water systems. And that's a central part. But the other part is keeping the city as compact as possible so that you can have shorter distances to travel and you won't need as many cars. The more you spread out, the more you kill off the natural ecosystems, and also you just have to have cars. So car dependence gets built in through this kind of sprawling cities. Right. And the more compact they are, the better to enable good public transport, walking and cycling.
Right. But Professor Newman, you and Mr. Svein Hermling both work extensively on the idea of resilience and sustainability. Now, as you mentioned, what we need to do and plan ahead for places that need to be developed, but we know many parts of the world that are causing the most harm in terms of emissions are the most developed nations. How do we integrate the idea of resilience in the way forward, especially when we talk about a post-COVID world? What are some of the things that need to be kept in mind?
Yeah, resilience is something that we need to build into everything we do from here on, so that the IPCC call it climate resilient development. And that means you have to work on how to adapt for the changes that are coming anyway. We are going to have higher temperatures, more extreme storm surges, more extreme bushfires, these kind of things, and probably more pandemics. So we have to be very careful about those wild areas and bush foods and so on that come from them. We do need that kind of adaptation, but at the same time, we need to be mitigating. We need to be contributing to a world that is rapidly moving to zero carbon. Solar, batteries, electric vehicles all need to fit into this now because they're cheap. They are the cheapest form of energy and transport is now electric and solar based. So we need to rebuild our cities around that, and climate resilient development will follow.
Right. Mr. Svein Hermling, same point there about creating resilience in the post-COVID world. How do we do that?
Linking to what the colleague said earlier is, I think on the one hand, we need to be aware that there are many solutions available which have, let's say, multiple benefits, which can both combine, for example, resilience, building adaptation, and reducing emissions. Just a simple example, in some of the programming we're doing in some African countries, we've made good experience with early warning systems in rural areas powered by solar energy, which gives the people in rural areas on the one hand some better understanding on changes in the weather situation and how they can prepare for that, while at the same time do this with locally available energy, which is solar in that case. And of course, there are many more solutions. We've talked about the basically air pollution in many big cities, which to a large extent comes from fossil fuels, and that's something which we need to radically reduce. And I think there's increased awareness now that also, in particular, diverse systems are often more resilient than a very, let's say, single solution systems. I mean, if you have large-scale plantations, for example, just with one type of plant, they are often more vulnerable to all sorts of diseases or negative climate impact than if you have a diverse system which provides more opportunities. And so right. I think there's a lot of lessons, and now they need to be really implemented and be the driver basically for the economic stimulus packages and other measures.
Right. Mr. Svein Hermling, one last question. You mentioned here early warning signs and the importance of them in trying to create resilience in terms of climate change. Now, how does these really work? Because we know that there were a lot of early warning signs for this pandemic as well, and they weren't given the due importance. How do we deal with policymakers? I mean, what are the conversations that climate activists are having about actually getting these early warning signs to get people to take action, to get people to preempt something?
Well, I think once we are beyond this pandemic, which will take some time, but I think more and more people already see today is that those countries or even communities who have taken early action and who have taken the first warning signs of this pandemic very serious, in my understanding, if I look at the statistics worldwide, have managed this better with less impact and getting out of it more quickly. And I think this should give us an important lesson and hopefully also increases the confidence into the scientific findings we have on climate change and the action that needs to be taken, which is so solid and so clear, and that now when we move out of this, basically the scientific evidence and the guidance we have needs to really be, let's say, like the guidelines or the manual for the recovery. And I think overall this crisis has increased confidence in the need and the importance of
Right.
good and valued science.
Right. Just very quickly, Professor Peter Newman, because we have to go for a short break after this. Do you agree with that? After this, these warning signs, everything, these preemptive measures will be taken more seriously?
Yes, I think it was a very clear case study of the role of science in policy making. The good public health scientists standing up with the politicians saying what needs to happen. So together, that partnership was very clear, and it showed how government action led to better economic outcomes, better health outcomes. So all of that can be done in climate change, in all of these other environmental issues. Get the science right, link to policy, and away you go.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Professor Peter Newman, for joining us, Mr. Svein Hermling for joining us. We're going to go for a short break, but when we come back, we're going to continue our conversation on climate change. Stay with us. Welcome back to the show. Now, as governments discuss reopening economies, is there space and a will to implement green recovery plans? And what will the world look like in a couple of decades if we do not work towards creating sustainable development paths? Joining us for this discussion is Professor Ahmet Sedat, who is a professor of economics and finance and the head of Department of Economy and Finance at Istanbul Aydın University. He joins us from Istanbul. Also joining us today is Mr. Svein Tveitdal, who's the former UN Director of Climate Change and Director of Klima 2020, a climate consultancy. He joins us from Oslo. Thank you both for joining us and welcome to the show. Professor Aybar, I'd like to begin with you. Now, just trying to set the foundation for our conversation to follow. When we talk about the level of emissions that have dropped globally, that has, of course, been due to the fact that economies have been disrupted. Let's discuss to what extent production has been completely dismantled for us to see these changes, which we are appreciating as clean air around the world.
There's no doubt that this contraction in world economy helped the environment a lot. And that proves that when the economy starts functioning without using capitalist kind of impetus, then that helps the environment. And that impetus came from fossil-based energy sources. And with the global warming and making the world not very sustainable environmentally, now this is opening up a new era. It's providing us with opportunities to open up a new era in which we could implement certain technologies to continue on the production line. And that production line, the model that we might develop on top of this, might help us helping environment and help us putting in place a sustainable developmental economic model. So this is this conjuncture whereby we are facing with the problems of coronavirus and fighting the pandemic. It opens up opportunities for providing us with opportunities to replace the unsustainable economic model that we have been experiencing in the near past. So this is to what extent production line has been affected by this. You know, almost 81% of world trade, those shops and the production line has been shut down. And it has been shut down to the extent that the economy no longer can sustain fighting against the pandemic. Therefore, particularly in developed countries, now we are facing with a situation that opening up of the economy is very much on the agenda.
Right.
Starting with the United States, this radical change is taking place that regardless of the loss of life and bringing economic priorities to the fore, that kind of change is bouncing back, but not necessarily on the basis of what we left before. So there is, it seems like opening up of the economies will come in place with newly developed or newly adopted these online systems, online practices of doing business. And this is like, this is introducing a radical change in the way we live this life.
Professor Ahmet, Aybar is talking about the fact that there might be opportunities on how to move forward. It's being reported, like, for instance, you mentioned how the United States, like all other economies, is itching to reopen. The United States Environmental Protection Agency has stopped regulating polluters in the midst of the coronavirus. This is just one example of what happened during this pandemic, that sustainable policies, regulations of trying to maintain a certain level of green policies went down the agenda during this. Once economies open up, what do you foresee happening? Will there be space to implement green recovery plans?
As I could see it from my end of the world, that the model we have implemented in the past, it was not very a sustainable model. It wasn't only polluting environment, but it is also creating poverty, migration. It's creating internal strife. It's creating international wars. It's creating all sorts of problems that we are facing now. The gift that we have from the past has been as a result of the model we have implemented. And at the center of that model is the fossil-based energy. It is the petroleum companies, oil companies, and these were the drivers of that civilization. Now, I think we are in a conjuncture where we came to the end of this. That kind of civilization, the oil-based, petroleum-based civilization.
Right.
The civilization that polluted the environment, we came to the end of it. I'm not saying it's going to disappear overnight. I'm not saying that it'll be finished there. But now new
see
forces
the end of it in sight. Right. Professor Aybar, stay with me on that. I want to jump to Mr. Svein Tveitdal and talk to him about this very point that you raised. Mr. Tveitdal, given this pandemic and the fact that countries are realizing how they propped up systems which could not withstand such crises, and they won't be able to do so in the future if they continue on this path. Do you agree with what Professor Aybar talked about here, that we might be seeing an end to the previous development model?
Well, I think the current crisis gives us an opportunity, but it is not clear that we will, in a way, take it. And first of all, I think it's quite clear that climate change and nature loss is a bigger threat to mankind, and it will cost more lives than the coronavirus, and it does not have an end. We have seen now impact on both emissions and on nature. New estimates now says that we will maybe have a global reduction in emissions on 5.5% this year due to the coronavirus impacts. But this is not enough, actually, to keep us on a track to limit warming to 1.5 degrees. Possibly it is on track to limit warming to 2 degrees. And we also see that nature is booming when they get free for a minute from the humans, like turtles that are hatching on beaches that was filled up with people, and you can see wild animals in the cities.
Right.
But the point here is that the pandemic is probably the worst possible way we could try to solve the global climate and nature crisis on.
Right.
And
Mr. Tveitdal, on just that specific point that you mentioned here, I want to go back to talking about that a little more. As you mentioned, there are predictions that emissions will fall to 5.5%, and still we will not be reaching our target of keeping a warming of under 1.5 degrees Celsius. This will barely get us through keeping it under 2 degrees Celsius. And we have a complete lockdown in many parts of the world. Is that target of keeping the rise below 2 degrees Celsius or 1.5 degrees Celsius too idealistic for the world we're seeing now?
It depends on the decisions that are taken, is been taking now. And, we need change. And crisis is opportunities for changes. But changes happen during the crisis and necessarily not after. If all the money we are now spending to fight coronavirus brings us back to business as usual, we are not one single step closer to a world that is warming up and to nature that are disappearing. So, but we see now that the world has the, in a way, it can solve crisis and spend a lot of efforts when we see it coming the next day. So we must have two thoughts in our head now. With all the money we are spending on bailouts and other means, we need to put requirements and start a kickoff or green change while we do all these investments. Because if we come back to business as usual, it will be too late and we have to use a lot of more money. But this is a big challenge to politicians. And there are debates going on all over the world now with people that see this very clearly and with other people that think that if we just come back to business as usual, then we have solved the problem.
Right. Mr. Tveitdal, you raise a very interesting point that changes happen during the pandemic, not necessarily afterwards. Professor Ahmet, Aybar, on that very point, the trends that you're seeing all across the world in terms of bailout packages and how economies are dealing with the damage, do you feel like that change is happening during this pandemic that Mr. Svein Tveitdal and you yourself stressed is so essential for us to move towards greater sustainable development?
We have to move towards greater sustainable development. There is no doubt about it. And I fully agree that crisis, and this type of crisis particularly, that's accompanying with health and economic crisis together, that we witness with pandemic COVID-19, this kind of crisis, the nature of those, inherently they carry with them some dynamics of change within themselves. Now, but, your question, whether we are witnessing that dynamics of change taking over the world, I don't think so. One of the problems is this, the past model produced losers, as I mentioned, with income, worsened income distribution, poverty, and so on and so forth, but it also created winners. Now, those winners, they want to go back to business as usual. So they're fighting tooth and nail to provide, to continue with the model to continue into the future. And it seems like governments did not develop, be it in European Union, in Europe, or the United States in developed world, or in other parts of the world, where their response to pandemic has been rather weak. This is the change, the expected change that will bring environmentally friendly policies is not taking place per se. The change is very slow. The change is very much fed by the profit motives of the companies that has been winners in the past world. But somehow, with this oil prices going into negative, it pushes the interest of those people who are fighting tooth and nail to continue with the business as usual, to change their attitude. And this may provide us with a glimmer of hope about having a more sustainable, more equitable global economy that puts human beings to the fore. It brings human lives to the fore, the environment to the fore, fighting poverty, racism, fighting all sorts of degradations of the environment, inequalities, and that kind of stuff. That glimmer of hope is there, but it seems like the forces that wants to continue business as usual is too powerful, that we need to deal with this. The governments should particularly from developing world, governments should come up with alternative policies that would, shift the production base and arrangements around distribution towards more sustainable economic model.
Right. On that point, thank you so much, Professor Ahmet, Sedat, Aybar, for joining us, taking out the time to talk to us. Mr. Tveitdal, just to reiterate what the world will look like if we don't take the measures that are needed to take to change how we're damaging the environment around us. Let's talk about pandemics. What does the world look like in a couple of decades if we continue business as usual?
Well, if we continue business as usual, we will be back on track to a warming on 3, possibly 4 degrees in this century. And that is actually it's not a recipe on climate crisis, it is a recipe on climate catastrophe. But there is a lot of things that can be done now. So that's why it's so important to take the opportunities. Take an example from Norway. Oil companies here, they would like to have a reduction on taxes. It's not a good idea. The challenge for the world now is to recover economy and to create jobs, because there are a lot or more jobless people. Let me just give you some very concrete examples on what we can do. Right. We need to put more money into green technology research and development. We can now take the opportunity when we have all this money we use to boost investments in renewable energy solutions. Offshore windmills, for example, is one thing that is very much actually in Norway. We can boost production investments in green transport, like support production of electric vehicles, EVs, boost battery production. One of those most hit now is, of course, tourism, and we can ensure that the money we are using now is channeled in a direction that gives green tourism a boost. We also need to invest in nature protection that also will create jobs. And when we have the bailouts, which I think is correct in the current situation, we have, where possible, to include environmental conditions and phasing out the use of fossil fuels in these bailouts. Right. So all these opportunities are there, all the money are there, but we have to take the right decisions, not after the crisis, but just now.
Right. That's such an important point. It can't be highlighted enough how action needs to be taken during this crisis, not just waiting after it's done with. On that point, I'd also like to introduce Professor Gina Reinhardt, who is a senior associate professor in the Department of Government at the University of Essex, where she heads multiple research teams studying resilience and disasters. She joins us from Essex. Thank you so much, Professor Reinhardt, for joining us, and welcome to the show. You must have heard the last bit of what Mr. Svein Tveitdal was talking about in terms of how we move forward not just after the crisis, but during it. Now, talking more about how environmental conditions need to be put forth to governments, what are some of the important things you feel like need to happen, and how do they get communicated to the policymakers during this time?
Some of the really important things we need to think about are how we're going to handle environmental emissions moving forward. Typically, what we would expect is that when the economy begins again and people stop social distancing and go back to work, their activities are really going to surge. And in many cases, we're going to see a cancellation of any gains that we've gotten for the short-term shortage or stoppage of emissions. So what we need to consider is how to regulate that and phase in people's activity and take this as an opportunity to try to implement some new systems and to try to change things and switch things to renewable energy instead of the fossil fuels. Instead of gearing up fossil fuels again, we want to see if we can gear up sustainable energy instead.
Right. Professor Reinhardt, with the global political climate that exists right now, do you think that will be a possibility? We are continuously throughout the show, we have talked about the opportunity, and seizing it is the need of the hour. But given what's happening across the political landscape, do you see that as a possibility? And if yes, what can be done to, mobilize more efforts for convincing stakeholders?
I think it's only a possibility if efforts really are well mobilized, because the fact is that the concern over the environment was heightened before this pandemic took place. And at this point, it has been pushed to the sidelines as people are dealing with the pandemic. It's no longer such a key issue in people's minds. We have to get it back into the minds of people. And the way to do that is to link it to the pandemic and to highlight the ways in which climate change have contributed to the spread of the pandemic and to the pandemic itself. That is the really big crux here, is to make it relevant to the things that people are really focused on. And to get that message into the minds of stakeholders, we need to have some pretty vociferous and vibrant campaigning going on.
Right.
That's not just about social distancing, but that's about how this pandemic is a result of climate change and how addressing climate change moving forward will prevent future pandemics and will help us get out of this one.
Right. Professor Reinhardt, I feel like this is an opportunity to reinforce and reiterate that very message you were talking about, linking climate change to this very pandemic and why it's gotten as bad as it has. If you don't mind just talking about that a little more.
Well, one of the some of the effects of climate change that we see are general warming in certain places and drastic weather and meteorological fluctuations. The fact is that the interaction with animals and the spread of viruses among species is a result of changing behaviors of people and species as a result of climate change. There are also some virological traits about the spread of the pandemic itself. I think it's very clear that our treatment of the environment as something very casual and something that we're not incredibly worried about is indicative in the need to travel, the widespread airline travel, and the way in which people handle themselves in those situations. And airline travel is most certainly the way that this virus spread from one location to another. So unless we address how those things are contributing to the pandemic, we will not be addressing climate change.
Right. That's a very strong point, and we're going to end it on that. Professor Gina Reinhardt, thank you so much for joining us. Mr. Svein Tveitdal, thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for watching Indus Special. We will see you again tomorrow with more stories. Till then, goodbye and take care.